Well, it's officially spring, isn't it? Yes. But you never know what can happen in Minnesota. We also know that. I think it was back in 1982. It was the middle of, I remember this because my birthday's in April. It was middle of April. And it snowed 2 feet. And maybe some of you remember that day. And MnDOT shut all the roads. I mean, it was a snow day for adults. We didn't have to go to work. And I put on my cross-country skis and skied to a friend's house to play Monopoly. We always schedule spring fling in May, and May is definitely spring, right? One year I bought a new spring dress, and then I ended up, it was so cold that night, I ended up wearing a thick sweater and slacks. And one year, remember the year we had those torrential rains? Yeah. Maybe spring in Minnesota, might be our first mistaken identity. Okay, so can you relate to this? Spring. You go for a walk wearing your parka and you see someone else wearing shorts. Have you ever switched from heat to air conditioning in the same day? And then back again? Do you believe that driving is better in winter because the potholes are filled with snow? That's Minnesota. One of the good things about Minnesota is the Minnesota Science Museum. I don't know if you've been there recently, but my husband and I went last week, and we wanted to see this space exhibit. And we watched an IMAX movie about the Hubble telescope, which was awesome, and I'll probably talk more about that another Sunday, but I want to talk about a little of this movie that showed the astronauts dealing with zero gravity in space. The astronauts guide and propel themselves by grabbing handles along the walls, and there's a place in the space station where 2 corridors intersect. It makes this cross. And the movie camera focused right on this intersection, right? And void of all life forms, you just see all this paraphernalia. And then suddenly, 4 astronauts' heads from all directions come and pass, just like clockwork, over and under each other, pass through these corridors, and then they're gone. I bet they had fun practicing that. It was so precisely choreographed. When the astronauts are in the shuttle or in the space station, they just wear plain clothes. They dress in polo shirts and regular slacks. But when they go out into space, they put on those big, sophisticated suits. And those suits allow them to survive in space and keep them tethered to the ship so they don't drift off. Spacesuits are amazing in their capability to protect and provide what's needed. And our human bodies are like that too. Our bodies protect and provide for us. Our bodies are actually marvelous spacesuits, aren't they? Think about it. We're adventurers and explorers on the spaceship Earth, right? And our bodies are our spacesuits. Sometimes people get confused and think that they are their body, that this body is who and what we are. And that when the body dies, that's the end of us. But we are so much more than our bodies, aren't we? We're more than our thoughts and our feelings, and we're more than our personalities. Our personality is our earthly persona. It's a sense of self that we hold. It's all the opinions and characteristics that make up who we think we are. Our personalities are inconsistent. They're unreliable. They're based on appearances. They're constantly changing and evolving and shifting. Our self-concept even involves probably sub-personalities, like that inner critic who's always criticizing, never satisfied, always judging. Was the ego something different than that? The ego is also a sense of self. Here's what Charles Fillmore wrote about the ego in The Revealing Word. Ego, the I. The ego is man, woman, and by reason of our divinity we make and remake it at will. The ego of itself is possessed of nothing. It is a mere ignorant child of innocence, floating in the mind of being. I like that. Innocence floating in the mind of being. But through the door of its consciousness must pass all the treasures of God. Sometimes the ego gets a bad rap, doesn't it? People kind of look at it like the enemy, like the ego, they might label it as greedy and selfish and, just self-centered and focused on material gain or whatever, but it doesn't have to be that. We need our ego. We need our personalities, because it's from ego and personality that we make choices in our life, and we make choices to begin to wake up to our spiritual identity. Reverend Paul Hasselbeck wrote a great book. It's kind of a textbook called The Heart-Centered Metaphysics. And in there he explains there are two basic attitudes of mind that can make up our identity: personality and individuality. Personality is a perception of ourselves that is made up of the characteristic that we have invented to distinguish ourselves from other people. Personality is who we think and feel that we are. But individuality is our true identity, and it consists of the characteristics that reflect our unique expression of the Christ mind. He says individuality is what we are. Reverend Paul and many people in Unity today use this term, individuality, but in some of our older literature it was called spiritual ego. And the revealing word that spiritual ego is defined as the true self, that individualized center of God, the I am, our conscious identity. So individuality is our true self. It's our spiritual identity. And our true self is not separate from God. This individuality is eternal. It never changes its identity, unlike our personality, which is fluctuating. So today is Palm Sunday, the day that Jesus and his disciples rode into Jerusalem, arrived in Jerusalem, and Jesus rode in on a donkey. And many other people were making that trip too, traveling into the city for the Passover celebration. There was a feeling of joy and festivity. People crowded around Jesus and placed palm branches on the ground and shouted, "Hosanna!" And he rode in on this donkey, which was symbolic of being a king. That is his message to us, too. We are of the Most High. Jesus was human and he was divine, and we are human and we are divine. Now, just for a moment, picture those astronauts again in that cross section, crisscrossing in that quarter of space. Imagine that kind of cross, like an X. We don't typically use the Christian symbol of a cross here because we prefer to focus on Jesus' life rather than his death. But just imagine that cross. The horizontal line of that cross is our humanity, our personality, our earthly physical form. And then picture how it intersects with a vertical line of the cross, going up and down. That vertical line represents our divine nature, our individuality. Here's another quote from Reverend Paul. "Individuality is what we truly are and always will be. It is our unique and individual expression of the Christ idea. Individuality is composed of the attributes of our spiritual nature. That is our eternal true identity. It is the real self. Individuality is the amount of the Christ idea that we are able to express from our current level of consciousness. From our current level of consciousness." So picture where those two lines intersect again. The horizontal line, our personality, our physical expression of humanness, and we can move up the vertical line as our consciousness increases. How? How can we learn to live from our individuality, that vertical line on the cross? How can we raise that point of where those two lines intersect? First and foremost, apply our spiritual practices of prayer and meditation. Listen for that still small voice within. And second, and we've talked about this a lot lately with Robert Brumant's book, the importance of self-awareness and self-observation. So observe yourself. Learn to recognize when we're living from our personality, when we're way out there on that line, way far from the intersecting point. And by observing ourselves when we're way out there, we can learn to pull ourselves back in and be in alignment here. The more that we do this and learn to recognize and live not from personality, but to live on the vertical line, we take that opportunity to shift and get closer to the center. So we see things differently. And when we see from this higher perspective, we act differently, we talk differently, we think differently. The more we do that, the less we live from personality, and the more that we will be able to live from our individuality. So the title of this talk was Mistaken Identity. So what is that? What is our mistaken identity? That's when we don't remember that there are two parts to our life experience. We are this physical body, and it's wonderful, this earthly spacesuit and the thoughts and the feelings that we can have and our connections with beautiful people in our lives. But we're more than that. We're created in the image and likeness of God. We are unique expressions of the divine, our individuality, the I am that I am, the eternal true self that never changes. That's your identity. The eternal true self of me greets and honors the eternal true self